inaugural chapter of the Industry Futures series, which is a digital roundtable which examines the role of sustainable finance in advancing Canada's future economy. The series is presented by the Electronic Recycling Association, or ERA, which is a not-for-profit association founded in 2004, with the vision of negating the world's e-waste problem, cultivating environmental sustainability, and giving promise to socioeconomic development. My name is Tim Penketh. I'm the founder of TheFutureEconomy.ca, which is a Canadian online media and thought leadership platform. We produce multimedia content featuring leaders across various industries, government, academia, all about defining a strong vision for Canada's future economy. And we're very proud to be associated with ERA to present this panel to you today. Before we begin, I'll encourage you to go to futures.era.ca to stay informed of the Industry Futures series. And you can also go to TheFutureEconomy.ca to sign up for our newsletter for the latest content that we put out from Canada's thought leaders. So joining me for today's session, we have 4 accomplished speakers who I'm sure will bring some great fire in terms of this conversation. First is Yrjo Koskinen, who's the Associate Dean of Research and Business Impact and the BMO Professor of Sustainable and Transition Finance at the University of Calgary. We also have Trish Nixon, who's the Managing Director of Commercial Impact Banking at Vancity Community Investment Bank. We have Gildas Poissonnier, who is Director of Sustainability and Responsible Finance at Desjardins, and Usha Sthankiya, the Canadian Partner of Sustainable Finance and ESG at Deloitte. So thank you all for joining us. I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights on where Canada is now in terms of sustainable finance and ESG, what the challenges and opportunities are for us in that space, and what needs to be done now to lead and win within it. Thank you so much for being a part of this. So let's get started. Let's speak about success and standardization in terms of sustainable finance, ESG. First of all, as an opener, how important is sustainable finance to the future of Canada's economy? And how will we be able to measure our success within it against the country's overall socioeconomic performance? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to jump in. First of all, I think, hopefully a common opinion from this group assembled, but in terms of its importance, it's absolutely critical. I think it's very clear that pursuit of profit and capitalism kind of unchecked does not meet the needs of our society, and government and philanthropy can't solve some of the issues that we're facing alone. And then it becomes a question of scale and the driving forces and how can we achieve certain outcomes. And there's no doubt that the capital markets and financial systems have a huge role to play there. I think in terms of how we measure the importance and how we sort of think about that. I think what we're seeing in the realm of sustainable finance, and we'll talk about what that means in as we go through this conversation, I'm sure. But we're seeing increasingly a move toward intentionality and impact. And I think that, in terms of measuring the success, it's defining what are the objectives and the outcomes we're trying to achieve. Obviously, things like Paris climate commitments and global standards can help us measure the performance. And then in terms of our own socioeconomic kind of results nationally, these things are very intertwined. Sustainable finance, is about planet, and it's about people and socioeconomic determinants of health. And if we get it right, we'll start to kind of bridge those gaps and some of those major challenges that we're seeing. So, setting objectives, tracking against them, and of course, measuring along the way become critical components.
If I can tag on to the comment about the international nature of this, what we're starting to see across the country, particularly in the energy sector, is a concern on where financing is going to come from as it relates to internationally. So I think there is some maybe unwritten understanding with the Canadian major financial institutions that they will be there to support the transition. But we see quite explicit statements coming out of Europe, even a couple of banks in the US, talking about an unwillingness to finance the fossil fuel sector as a whole. And that, even though is not large portions of capital flowing into these sectors, it's big enough in aggregate to cause concern for these organizations. So there is an opportunity here from a Canadian perspective of how to step in and fill that gap and move towards meaningful transition in a way that makes sense for the country and allows also the financial markets to stand up and embrace a Canadian problem with a Canadian solution. I think, Trish, your point on the social side as well can't be understated, and thinking about the interconnectivity. We often talk about just climate and carbon and forget about all of the socioeconomic impacts of that across the board, and thinking through how all of the issues come together is critical to it's not just about putting pots of money in certain places, and there are people behind all of these projects, and I think maintaining that connection and that understanding, and then, Trish, as you say, the targets and goals that and metrics that go with that is critical to be able to see the impact we have and measure that appropriately.
And if I may add that, so Canada is a mid-sized power, mid-sized country, and we are hugely dependent on international capital markets. And this is an international trend. So in a sense, we don't have a choice. We have to adapt to sustainable finance, ESG investing. Europe is the leading continent for that. Of course, Canadian companies don't get that much financing from Europe. Some do. We do have great examples of green energy investment, like in Alberta already, that we get a huge amount of financing from Denmark, for example. But also now US is moving towards that direction since the latest SEC rulings. So Canada has taken into account these international developments, and sustainable finance will have to play a huge role in going forward. And while I agree with what Trish said, that we kind of the short-term profit maximization won't do the job, but I think we will get the best outcomes if the federal and provincial governments change rules and regulations and taxation so that profit maximization and sustainability go in hand. Then we get the best possible outcomes.
Yeah, on my side, I would say that sustainable finance to me is really two things. It's a signal to the market, the goal, the commitment that Canadian banks, Canadian financial institutions, Canadian co-ops like Desjardins have taken is really about providing the businesses a signal that, okay, this is important, the economy should be going into that direction. So it's really something that they can take on and orient their business in accordance to ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria, and sustainable finance. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, apart from that signal to the market, is really, in the end, it's a flow of real dollars to support those business activities in various sectors of the economy. So the real amount of dollars going into supporting the transition, into going into emerging sectors to support, for example, renewable energy, is really another concrete example of not only a signal, but a reality for those businesses. So that combination of forward-looking with a signal and also real business flows and financial flows today is really what sustainable finance, I think, is about, and key for our country overall socioeconomic performance.
Now, the fact that this is a global issue, and Canada, alongside Europe, alongside the US and other countries and regions, is moving at different speeds on this. If you had to look at that from a macro level, where do you think Canada ranks, or where do we place? How do we compare in terms of other regions that are competing for these same dollars? And also, what do you think has to be done by who? And this could be government, it could be industry, it could be regulators, to to position ourselves as leaders within that space. Any thoughts on that?
Canada ranks somewhere between Western Europe and US. So typically Canada is a kind of a transatlantic country. So somewhere not fully American, not fully European, somewhere in between. And that applies also for sustainable finance and ESG. In order to getting closer to Western European standards, I think we need, for example, better disclosure rules, mandatory disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions, mandatory disclosure of ESG policies, and also we need a Canadian-made taxonomy, so classification for sustainable finance. This is very, very important for us because we are a resource-dependent economy, and for example, we just can't copy European rules as such because they wouldn't suit our energy transition needs. So we need to really get in our house in order in terms of disclosure, taxonomy, and then what is also important that I think our financial institutions should be engaging with companies, not just saying, okay, we divest from, let's say, oil and gas, but engage with the oil and gas industries to help them along the transition path to the net zero. And the engagement has to be real, not just a greenwashing exercise. So you have to be, financiers have to put pressure and guidance to management to really stick to those net zero goals for 2050.
I mean, I'd absolutely agree with everything that's been said. And I mean, I approach this topic from, probably a slightly different place than some of the people around this table, kind of focus more on the real economy, versus the kind of larger capital markets, from a private, now bank lending kind of perspective into, intentionally into spaces that intentionally, are delivering on social environmental impact objectives. I think one of the key things when we're talking about sustainable finance is what are we talking about? And I think over the last, 20 years, we've kind of seen the what started out as actually kind of a moral or ethical, trend in terms of, responsible investing, trying to, weed out unethical behavior, and then moving into risk management from an ESG perspective. And I think that's, very mainstream now, and that's been fantastic in terms of developing all of these taxonomies and standardizations. And I mentioned in my opening statement, but I think the what we need to and are starting to see, and I think to lead, is again really moving from ESG screening and ESG management into impact and outcomes alignment and impact and outcomes generation. And I think there's various places along the capital market spectrum where that can happen. Again, want to kind of direct investments into private companies, large investments into public companies, activism and kind of shifting behavior. And I'd absolutely agree that we need to lead by action. And I think that Canada is behind Europe, where more investors are starting to think about impact measurement and management frameworks, and building them into kind of different asset classes and different ways that they're approaching their investment businesses. But we're starting to see that in Canada. I think we're in the kind of innovator early adopter phase, and that's an area where our investors, and we have some of the largest investors in the world, can really be leaders, and government kind of setting standards and policymakers and regulations can certainly help that happen faster and help remove tensions that can exist between traditional investment objectives and some of these sustainable investment objectives.
Yeah, so just to the characterization that was made, and I think it was made a couple of times, of where Canada sits between Europe, behind Europe and ahead of the US. I would agree with that conceptually, and I think that's sort of where we typically find our place is we're behind what's happening in Europe, but certainly we're ahead of the US. I think that's where Canada likes to position itself. And in that regard, from a sustainable finance perspective, and Trish, I think the point you raised about it starting years ago as a moral issue, I think is an extremely valid one, and one I'd like to pick up on, because how we got to this place of behind Europe and ahead of the US is riding that wave. But where we need to go next, and I think we should give ourselves credit for riding that wave and doing it without the regulation that's been present in Europe, that this has come all naturally from within organizations. But it has typically been a pocket of people or groups of people off to the side, or outside, putting pressure on organizations. And now this is a C-suite issue. CEOs, the latest AGMs of the banks that happened recently were full of questions on climate, and this is very much a front and center business issue, which gets to the tensions that Trish, you're raising of how do we manage. Is this about doing good or doing the right thing, or is this about running my business? And I think that argument is counterproductive to where we need to go and how quickly we need to make that transition. And to your question, Tim, on what needs to change, I think it's the speed. So this point about putting that into action, I agree with completely, and I think that needs to be done very quickly, because the time is ticking. It's not so straightforward to turn over an entire portfolio of investments when we're trying to reach 2030. There are many things with some of these longer term, take mortgage portfolios, for example, that you need to start doing today. It's not a future issue, and every IPCC report that comes out readjusting the temperature scenarios and talking about what needs to happen, I think we keep treating those as, okay, well, they keep coming out. We'll make small changes, and we're making such incremental changes that when it's too late, we'll realize we didn't move quickly enough. We're already 2022. And we're talking about 2030 targets, which feels long-term from a traditional business perspective, but is not in any way long-term in terms of what needs to happen to reach those targets.
On my side, maybe two elements, and I think all the ideas from my fellow panelists are great. I think partnerships is one element I would put on the wish list, because a partnership like public-private sector partnership on the financial side are key and are emerging. So socioeconomic development agencies, Development Bank of Canada, BDC, EDC, I think all those agencies have a clear mandate also to incorporate more of ESG and climate focused activities, and likely the private sector banks or financial corps to have the same objective. So I think it's in the making, but we should step up the pace of those partnerships to take more risks, as you mentioned, and move forward. The second one, I think, is really about training. From the top level objectives that we do have in sustainable finance, I think to really scale it up on the ground, and with the companies that require finance and investment, we need to have the account managers, the account executive from the financial sector to be more aware of those topics, and that will only come by training and cultural change as well.
Usha, you brought this up, so I apologize. I'll put you on the spot first, if you don't mind. You want the pace to be accelerated. If you could point to one or two, one or two big opportunities or easily attackable, so to speak, opportunities that you would think would have the biggest impact on accelerating that pace, do any come to mind? And this is open to the rest of you as well. Do you have a wish list in terms of what we should be looking at first?
I probably do have a wish list, I think so. There are a couple things come to mind. Certainly, policy is one of them, and meaningful, detailed policy, not press release level policy. I think that needs to be there, and government needs to really play that role, versus putting out policy and also hoping the financial system does its thing and in enacting that in a way that the two need to work together, I think, much more closely. Of for sure, the financial systems will incentivize certain behaviors. But we do need, I think, stronger policy from a climate perspective. And my sense is that it's coming, and maybe I need to be a little bit more patient for that. But certainly the indicators out of the recent budget were encouraging that more detail is coming. The other thing I think about is scaling technologies that are available, that investment dollars into, there are many viable technologies that currently exist that need to be scaled and done quickly, which takes investment. And I think traditionally the way that we've looked at investing in these types of projects that don't have the long run and the stretch of results that can be looked at, we look at our investment dollars differently. And if we continue to do that, I don't know that we'll scale all these technologies in quick enough to be able to provide viable alternatives. I'm sure others on the panel have their own wish list, so I'll stop it at just those two.
Usha, maybe I'll just jump in on one of the comments that you made and maybe expand upon it. Less of a overarching wish list, but in terms of investing in technologies and where technologies are going, or and scaling them quickly enough. I think that's so critical. At the same time, and the work that I've been doing over the last decade, so much of it is actually about deploying existing technologies that can really move the needle today. And I think that's around really actually looking at the real economy, the built environment, where incentives lie, where kind of the risk return of financing, being obviously the topic of this conversation, some of these projects and helping solutions be more turnkey. And when we're talking about the energy space in particular, it's challenging because we've got different regulations in different places. But I do think that's where, government has a huge role to play in terms of helping create investable structures, because there's so much money that is so keen to move into, financing sustainable development, financing clean energy, financing, especially on the infrastructure side. But we've got to get the structures right to really attract that capital. And I do think that public money and public policy can play a huge role in doing that and really shifting the needle with the technologies we have today.
So my wish list will be very, very simple. Couple of items. We need more active ownership. The trend since the past 30 years has been towards passive index investing, especially in public corporations. That won't do anything, or we might do something, but very, very little for climate change and ESG goals. Even if we say in passive investment, I divest from, let's say, oil and gas. Well, there's always investors coming to replace if you divest. Maybe it affects cost of capital a little bit. But in order to have a real impact on greenhouse gas emissions, on other ESG goals, we need active owners that are not afraid to engage with management and put pressure if needed. So that's going to be, I would see this is kind of the return of active investment and active ownership to spotlight. And second, what I think Canada desperately need is more willingness to take risk. Canada has a reputation of being a very risk-averse country. And let's say our high-tech companies, if they need serious money, they usually go to the U.S. venture capital market. We need to have a venture capital market here that is willing to take risks and willing to make big bets. Otherwise, we come up with fantastic technological innovations here, then they finance in the US, and suddenly we realize that, oh my God, the headquarters have moved to Austin or San Francisco or Denver. And we want to have the value creation happening here in Canada, not in the United States.
Maybe one comment on that topic is really about having the transversal view of the board competency. We speak a lot about board profile or profile of competencies at the board, and not really as as only, all individuals next to each other, but together, do they have the right skill sets, the right approach, and the right angles? But once again, like Yrjo mentioned, and back to Usha points, like it's a tricky question about, okay, should you go like mandatory mandate or just let the market decide? I think we should push for sure to have more rapid change, and both voluntary and maybe exploring on specific areas, and women diversity, gender diversity could be one angle where mandatory action could be explored potentially. Yeah.
Well, those are two very important topics, talent, skills, and culture, that we will address. Before we get there, I want to shift gears a little bit and look at the role of boards. It's come up a few times that this is no longer an issue off to the side. It's very much at the C-suite, and obviously very much discussed and influenced by what happens around the board table. To provide the necessary oversight and the support that's needed for this kind of transition, boards obviously need to have access to the right ESG information to be reported to them, so that they can issue the right guidance, ask the right questions. So I have a question in two parts. Firstly is, what would you define as the right ESG information that our boards need to have at their disposal? And secondly, how does a company's board need to evolve to adequately oversee and enable itself to support a company's ESG and sustainability strategy? What has to change for board information and board structure and practice? Any ideas on that?
I can start maybe on the board. I think it's quite simple in terms of having a clear dashboard of material ESG issues. Like the materiality aspect is key, because ESG is so broad, sustainability is so broad, that you could speak virtually from everything that relates to the business. So being focused on ESG issues, and for example, SASB is a good example of what's important for different sectors, different businesses. And also having a right balance between opportunities and risks. So risk could be looked at, okay, well, for example, what is my exposure from a lending or investment perspective to carbon intensive sectors? That's kind of a risk approach. But as important is the opportunity side. How much do we perform, or do we have success, commercial success in developing new products like transition finance products, sustainable finance products, and do they really have an impact? So having the two sides of the coins are important. And second elements that I think is important for boards to have is a clear monitoring of stakeholders' perception or trends, if you like, in terms of expectation. Of course, from the client side of the business, but also more generally speaking from a social and political elements, because in the end, ESG is about society expectation. So I think boards should have that in mind, that the world is changing, and how does it change? I think you should bring that monitoring component in it. And to the second part of your question, Tim, I would say that really it's about the ESG competency level that boards need to continue to develop. And back to my earlier point, it's about training on the different topics, climate, obviously, but also EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion. I think you need to raise the bar for competency of board members.
Well, thank you, Gildas. I fully agree with you. Now, I would like to continue from the how boards need to change. So right now, boards are too stale, too male, and too pale. So we need younger folks that have different perspectives. We need more women in boards and more diversity in boards. The old guys who are now sitting in the major Canadian boards, I think they're a little bit lost. They think that this is something terrible that is happening to Canada, that now we have to take all these ESG issues into account. No, this is essential to our business future. Every company needs to have a sensible ESG policies in order to attract talented employees. This is not just like a hobby that, oh my God, it's going to cost us a lot of money. No, this is something that is really important for the survival of businesses. So we need people who have more competencies in the ESG space, and we need different perspectives. So the old ways of doing business won't do going forward. So, and I think hopefully we get more diversity and more younger people and more women in the boards that have a little bit different perspectives and maybe even better competencies in terms of sustainability.
Yeah, I would agree with the point wholeheartedly on composition. I think Gildas has a very valid point on the education side, that's needed no matter what the composition of the board is to stay current. But that said, I think really the underlying component is composition. Many of the current board directors are moving from one organization to the other, have cross-cutting sectors that are complementary in the traditional way that our economy has flourished. That may not still work in a low carbon future and as we transition. And so I think really looking in the mirror on from a composition aspect, and a number of them were named in areas that we need to look at. And I mean, there are others who speak widely about this topic of how Canada treats board appointments, and so I don't think we're saying anything new here in that regard, but certainly I think it's the issue becomes all the more critical when you are dealing with the topic of sustainable finance and ESG and how to truly govern the organization through the transitions.
Yeah, I mean, I'd absolutely agree with all the points on composition, and I guess where I'd, I guess pick up or emphasize is on Gildas's, comment about opportunities and risks. I think that the board should obviously, ESG management, as I think is part of a fiduciary responsibility, which a board has. But from the perspective of talent, of staying ahead of the curve, of staying relevant, of staying on top of shifting regulatory environments. Those are all risk factors where, I think boards have an obligation to be, management teams have an obligation to be kind of setting strategies and performance indicators, and boards have an obligation to be asking for that information and staying on top of it where it's relevant for that company and sector. But simultaneously, I think looking at, what a company does, where its potential, where there's opportunities that align, where sustainability aligns with core business objectives and growth. I mean, the way there's, I would say in every sector, in every company, you can find those opportunities where, and maybe there's risk-taking components, but where there are growth opportunities that align with sustainability objectives, again, because of the way consumers and kind of the world and competitiveness is changing. And so I think that, aside from kind of all the common, there's sort of kind of standard information that, boards should be looking for, performance indicators around opportunities to grow the business by implementing sustainability and ESG plans, and then, measuring on an ongoing basis how companies are tracking toward those objectives is an important part of where the value that a board can kind of bring to this conversation.
I've got a follow-up question on the diversity issue, the diversity of boards. Should it be mandated? Why not? And if so, what would you like to see? Or what would you not like to see? What are your thoughts on all that? Yes, so should representation on board should we mandate that a board has to have a certain percentage of women or people under 30 or people from underrepresented groups or do you think that should be a matter of policy or should that be left to companies to decide?
I think that the way the sustainable finance movements and kind of markets are and ESG is advancing, it won't. Mandates could move things more quickly, certainly, but I think companies intrinsically are already and will increasingly be setting their own targets or objectives around board composition and diversity and things like that. And investors are expecting it, more and more. And so I think those are really positive, signals. I think one of the challenges with mandates is they don't consider context, or it's harder to have kind of blanket mandates in very different contexts and, pace of change. But I certainly think that every company should have, objectives and, be taking real action to ensure that they've got the right, composition and diversity on the board.
If you had a mandate, this is something that I have to do now. But if you have internalized, it's something that, I want to do this because it's good for my business. So I think we want to be. I mean, it might be a little bit slower. Changing the board composition might be, and will be more slower if there is no mandate. But I think that the end outcome might be better if we let's say let companies change intrinsically and not force them to change.
I'm going to take the opposite view, actually. And my reasoning for it is, we tried that with gender diversity on boards. We tried to let companies come to this conclusion on their own. And even, there's the 30% club where you have 30% of your board has female representation. Which doesn't seem like a huge target, but it was at that time, right? and I think I think we need to think about how long we're willing to wait, and what other pressures, and Trish, you brought up what investors are looking for as well, what other pressures might influence the rate of change when we consider mandates. So there was an opportunity from looking at the financial systems, the task force that was put in place, and they decided not to mandate board diversity, and instead recommend that organizations consider setting metrics for themselves to get to, and their perspective was simply that they didn't feel exactly as my panelists are saying. They didn't feel that mandating was actually going to get the end result that they were looking for. But the question I would raise on the back of that is can we afford to wait without the mandates if this is an issue that is so critical? Do we need a bit more of a heavy hand in order to get to that end result? Or do we think that there's enough internal pressures that will get there organically without forcing the issue?
Maybe one comment on that topic is really about having the transversal view of the board competency. We speak a lot about board profile or profile of competencies at the board, and not really as only all individuals next to each other, but together, do they have the right skill sets, the right approach, and the right angles? But once again, like Yrjo mentioned, and back to Usha points, like it's a tricky question about, okay, should you go like mandatory mandate or just let the market decide? I think we should push for sure to have more rapid change, and both voluntary and maybe exploring on specific areas, and women diversity, gender diversity could be one angle where mandatory action could be explored potentially. Yeah. I think Canadian business will attract, develop, and retain talent. When they are really true to their own company mission, structure, or mission and culture. To me, it's really the key to be successful on the talent side of that perspective. It's really when there is a match. There is a clear match between your ESG strategies, action, and your philosophy, if you like, with when you're trying to connect that with your employees and your stakeholders. That's when it works. So to me, that's really the angle. Second aspect, I would say that it's really key to highlight that ESG or sustainability is not the topic of a single remotely connected to business ESG team. It's really the responsibility of everyone in the organization, be you in marketing, finance, accounting, operations. You have an opportunity to play an ESG role in a business. Once again, from board members to employee, from executives to managers, there is a role. So I think that's also a signal that Canadian businesses should send to their workforce, that no matter if you have an ESG in your title, you can play a role. And that's when everybody will feel more empowered, that I think you can attract collectively as an organization talent that is geared towards ESG and sustainability, and retain it on the long term.
And as was mentioned before, we also have sort of now more international recognition with the creation of one of the ISSB's offices in Montreal, which is very much a big branding, let's call it that, win globally for Canada in terms of the importance that we play within this space, but also the potential we represent for shaping it. So I hope we do great on that one. The next questions were about company structure and culture, but I actually feel that we covered culture quite a bit. But I want to ask you if you feel like you want to add anything to that conversation. If so, please, I'll ask the question and you can go for it. If not, I just want to close up with some calls to action from each one of you. Does anybody want to address or add to the culture conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I'd call on, this is going out on a limb perhaps, but on our banking CEOs to make this their legacy, to really embrace the opportunities that are here. And, if it's so that you can be known as by your grandchildren as someone who did something positive for the planet, even if it was controversial or difficult to put through the organization. I think embracing the transition and building a legacy on it, it would be my call to action, and ties back to what we were talking about earlier on the pace that's required for the change we're looking for.
I would say call to action to be honest. We have in financial sector and in let's say in fund management, people have a tendency of saying that, hey, you can earn high returns and save the world. No, this is too good to be true. If you want to save the world and have real impact, that may cost you some money, but it's still worthwhile to do. So don't buy in the hype that, oh my God, ESG investing, great returns, and you save the world. And then also, I would have to call to action for honesty for our energy sector. We claim that we are the best in the ESG space in the world. That is inflated claim. That is not true. We are not the worst. We are pretty good, but there are better places for ESG investing in terms of oil and gas. So we have to be honest and not make inflated claims, because if we lose our reputation of honesty, nobody's ever going to buy our messaging.
Maybe one point, Tim, on culture. I think if you look at what university folks say on culture, you'll learn that it's not something that you can easily create or reframe or manipulate. It's like you and I. We have a character. You have your personality trait. When you are a business and an organization that has an history, I'm not talking about new businesses, of course, but when you have a 20 plus years of history, like your culture is pretty much set. So when does someone change its culture? It's only when you face a problem that culture is really something that maybe hinders or creates problem in your life. If like I don't want to change myself unless I feel that okay, I have personal relationship issues with my family or with my colleagues. So to me, it's the same thing. Organization, it's not easy to change your culture. So I would say, really, for people that want to select or choose a business where they want to work in, you really need also to look at the culture, because it's highly improbable that the company will change from a complete 360 shift in terms of how it works and how it operates. To me, that's really a key element. You need to look at the culture from an organization as a starting point that will really help drive the direction that it can go in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I love all of those points, and I think building on some of them, I'd call on investors, all investors, but especially large institutional investors, to look 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the line, and start planning for it now. And I think to make sure they're looking at needs and opportunities, because especially when it comes to the climate crisis or the ability to feed the world's population within the confines of our planets. To Yrjo's point, there's going to be actions that need to and are worth taking that may not be the opportunistic money making opportunities, but there's also going to be huge opportunities for to align our impact objectives and our societal needs with financial growth. And I think that investors need to be thinking about that in everything that they are doing today and moving quickly, because we don't have the time to wait.
Excellent. Well, I hope all those groups were listening and really have the courage to take your calls to action to heart and actually act upon them. That brings today's session to a close. I really want to thank you all. You've been amazing panelists, amazing guests. So thank you, Usha, Trish, Gildas, and Yrjo. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. To the audience, please do go to futures.era.ca to stay informed on the Industry Futures series, and go to TheFutureEconomy.ca to sign up for our newsletter to get more amazing thought leaders in Canada sharing their vision for the future of our economy. Again, I'm Tim Penketh. I'm the founder and CEO of TheFutureEconomy.ca. Thank you, panelists. Thank you to ERA. And thank you, everyone at home or at the office or wherever you may be, for watching this. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.